The words tore out of Isabella Bennett before she could stop them, before her mind caught up to her body, before the fear could paralyze her into staying invisible like it always did. I don't care if you own half this city, nobody puts their hands on a kid while I'm breathing. She stepped between two men in suits and a terrified boy pinned against brick, the child's lips split open, blood dripping onto his white shirt. August heat pressed down on the Chicago street like a suffocating blanket, thick as wet wool, thick as the kind of silence that happens right before violence. The overturned tamale cart lay behind them, cilantro and lime scattered across the sidewalk like confetti at a funeral. The two men, Rocco and Nino, though Isabella didn't know their names yet, turned to stare at her. Both wore black suits tailored well enough to cost more than everything she owned. Both had the flat, empty eyes of people who solved problems with their hands and their guns, and right now both were utterly stunned that a woman in a Walmart tank top soaked through with sweat had just told them no. Rocco took a step forward. His shadow fell across her shoulders. Isabella didn't move. Her hand shook, but she didn't move. Her voice had come out steady, like it belonged to someone else, someone braver, someone who hadn't spent 8 years learning that resistance meant pain, meant welts carved across her back in patterns that still burned on cold mornings. But the boy? The boy was someone else's son. The boy was not hers to sacrifice. The man you work for wouldn't want this either, she said, and the words kept coming because sometimes the mouth moves without permission from the terrified brain. Whatever debt your vendor here owes, whatever he did, a child has nothing to do with it. 10 feet away, a black SUV was parked at the curb, engine running, tinted windows so dark they might have been empty. But they weren't empty. Behind that glass, a 5-year-old boy named Marcus Corsetti pressed his small face against the cold window, watching a woman with nothing defend a stranger's child, watching her stand between danger and innocence like she had any right to do such a thing, like she had anything left to lose. His father sat 3 rows behind him, watching the same moment, and something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest, something that hadn't moved in 5 years, not since the nursery upstairs in his penthouse went silent. The restaurant doorway behind Rocco and Nino framed a man in an open white shirt, dark suit jacket draped over his shoulders like a cloak. Dominic Corsetti. 47 years old, with a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone, and eyes the color of a storm that hasn't broken yet. He had come to Marcello's for lunch, not to witness his men shake down vendors on a Tuesday, not to watch his son watch this woman. But he was watching now. Nino's hand moved toward his jacket. The movement was small, casual, the kind of gesture that preceded screaming, blood, bodies. Enough, Dominic said. The word came from the restaurant doorway, and it was like a blade through the August heat, like a knife cutting through air thick enough to strangle on. Rocco and Nino froze. Nino's hand dropped. In 15 years of working for Dominic Corsetti, they had learned that one word carried the weight of entire arsenals. He stepped toward them, toward Isabella, toward the boy with the split lip. His shoes were Italian leather, the kind that cost more than her car payment, and they clicked against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The boy goes home, Dominic said. He looked at Isabella, and in that look was something she didn't have a name for yet. And you? You come with me. She had $34 in her pocket. She had a 2004 Honda Civic parked 3 blocks away with her entire life folded into the back seat. She had welts on her back that spelled out 8 years of learning not to argue with powerful men. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, had not slept properly in 6 months, had not had a shower in 4 days because the shelter had exceeded capacity and the gas station bathrooms were no longer safe for a woman alone at night. But she had also just stood between a child and violence. So when Dominic Corsetti gestured toward the black SUV idling at the curb, Isabella Bennett walked toward it, and the afternoon swallowed the moment whole, and the boy with the split lip ran home to his father, and Rocco and Nino exchanged a look that said everything had changed without either of them understanding how. The SUV door opened. She climbed inside, and the world shifted on its axis. 3 hours later, at 6:16 in the evening, Dominic Corsetti would sit across from her in his private booth at Marcello's restaurant, the same booth where he watched his empire unfold over seafood and wine. Candlelight would catch the exhaustion in her face, every hardship carved into the lines around her eyes, and he would ask her to do the impossible. But that was 3 hours away. For now, she climbed into the SUV, and the door closed behind her with a sound like the lid of a coffin being sealed, final and complete. 24 hours earlier, Isabella Bennett washed her face in a gas station bathroom at 5 a.m., and the fluorescent light was unforgiving. Her reflection showed a woman who looked 35, though she was only 29. Exhaustion had aged her in ways that sleep couldn't fix, had etched itself into her skin like a map of every night spent in a car, every meal skipped, every morning she counted her money and found it was less than yesterday. The gas station bathroom smelled like bleach and desperation, that particular smell of places where people came to wash when they had nowhere else to go. She splashed water on her face, and it was cold, shocking cold that made her gasp. Her hands were calloused, the nails broken, her knuckles scraped from work. Everything she owned was either on her body or stuffed into the backpack sitting on the sink beside her: 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, underwear, socks, a worn journal, a phone with a cracked screen, and the one thing she couldn't lose, the one thing that kept her tethered to the person she used to be, a photograph of her mother, taken in 1995, before everything fell apart. She had exactly $34 in her pocket. $34 stretched across the rest of the week if she was careful. No food, just coffee stolen from break rooms, just whatever she could eat from behind the diner counter when the manager wasn't looking. $34 for gas. For tolls. For the towing bill that was coming because the Civic's transmission was making sounds it shouldn't make. The reflection staring back at her didn't look like it could survive another week. But the reflection had survived 8 years with Marcus Webb, so survival was the only thing it knew how to do. Survival and silence. Mostly silence. She dried her face with paper towels that disintegrated as soon as they touched skin, and she tried not to look too hard at the bruise on her upper arm, the one shaped like fingers, the one Marcus had given her 2 weeks ago when she'd made the mistake of asking when he was leaving. He'd left 3 days later, said he was done with her, said he'd find a woman who knew how to keep her mouth shut. She'd spent the last 2 weeks terrified he'd come back. The gas station clock said 5:23 a.m. She had 3 hours before she needed to be at the diner for her shift. 3 hours she could spend sleeping in the Civic or walking the empty streets trying to stay warm as the morning broke cold and gray. She chose walking. The August streets of Chicago were different at 5:51 in the morning. Quieter. Less populated by the people who would stare at her threadbare clothes, her worn shoes held together with duct tape, her hair pulled back with a rubber band because she'd never been able to afford a brush that worked. The homeless found the early mornings safer. The workers hadn't woken up yet. The police were somewhere else. Isabella had become an expert in small mercies. She knew which neighborhoods were safe at which hours. She knew which bathrooms she could use without being asked to buy something. She knew which restaurants threw out food at closing time if you knew the staff. She knew how to be invisible, how to move through the world without taking up space, how to apologize for existing. This was her 3rd year of existing like this. 2 years and 11 months since Marcus had drained every account, taken everything she'd saved for going back to school, everything she'd put away for emergencies. 2 years and 11 months since the eviction notice had come nailed to her apartment door like a curse she couldn't escape. She walked past Marcello's restaurant at 6:15 a.m. The lights were just coming on inside, the kitchen staff arriving early to prep for lunch. She didn't know that in 22 hours, she would be sitting in the private booth of this same restaurant, sitting across from Dominic Corsetti, watching candlelight play across the face of the most powerful man in Chicago while he asked her to save his son's life. She didn't know that her entire life was about to change, that the invisibility she'd cultivated so carefully was about to explode into something she couldn't control. She was thinking about whether she had enough money for coffee. The diner where Isabella worked was called Rosa's, and it had been there since 1987. Rosa had died in 1992. Her daughter kept the restaurant open more out of stubbornness than profit, paying her workers minimum wage plus tips that rarely materialized, serving breakfast to the same 30 people every morning, the same old men in the same booths ordering the same eggs. Isabella arrived at 7:55 a.m., 15 minutes early like always, and clocked in at 8 o'clock sharp. Her manager, a man named Derek who treated her with the casual cruelty of someone who knew she had nowhere else to go, nodded at her without looking up from his phone. "We're slow today." "You're cut at noon," he said. Slow meant tips would be terrible. Cut at noon meant only 4 hours of pay, maybe $40 after taxes, maybe $30. That brought her total for the week to something less than $200, and rent, even the rent for the tiny studio apartment she was saving toward, even the cheapest room she could find in this city, was more than $1,000. The math never worked. It never had. She pulled her apron on, tied it around her waist, and stepped into the morning shift. The regulars were already there. Mr. Patterson in booth 3, same coffee, black, no sugar. The Martinez twins in booth 5, sharing one order of eggs and toast. The businessman who came in Tuesdays and Thursdays and never made eye contact. She moved between tables like a ghost, like a prayer, like something that had learned not to take up space. She poured coffee. She wiped tables. She smiled when she needed to smile, apologized for things that weren't her fault, accepted insults about her appearance with the hollow numbness of someone who'd heard it all before. At 10:45 a.m., Derek told her she could go. $42.67. That was her income for Tuesday. She sat in her Civic in the parking lot and counted her money again. $34 from yesterday, $42.67 from today. $76.67. That had to last until Friday. Gas was going to cost $20. That left her $56.67 to eat on, to survive on, to exist in the spaces between now and the next shift. She started the engine. The transmission made that sound again, that awful grinding sound that meant something was breaking inside. She drove anyway, toward the park, toward the free library, toward the places where you could sit for hours and nobody asked you to leave. At the library, she found a quiet corner in the back, near the windows, and she sat in a plastic chair that was supposed to be comfortable but wasn't. She opened her journal and wrote the numbers down, like writing them down could make them make sense. Like writing them down could make the impossible possible. The numbers never changed. She was still sitting there at 3:15 p.m., still staring at the same numbers, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but the old habit of obedience kicked in, the habit that 8 years with Marcus had worn into her bones, and she picked up. "Is this Isabella Bennett?" a man's voice said. "Professional." "Clipped." "Yes?" She never said yes to unknown numbers. She never answered at all. But something in that moment, something in the tone of his voice, made her respond like she was still a person who could answer phones like a normal person. "This is Detective James Chen with the Chicago Police Department. We need you to come identify some items that were recovered from an incident. Can you come to the precinct on Division Street right now?" Marcus. It was Marcus. Something had happened to Marcus, or Marcus had done something, or the world was catching up to all the ways he'd broken things. She felt her chest tighten. "What kind of items?" she asked. "We'll explain when you arrive," the detective said, and the line went dead. She sat in the library for another 5 minutes, trying to breathe, trying to remember how to make her body move, and then she stood up, left her journal on the chair, because who would steal a poor woman's journal, and walked back to her Civic. The drive to Division Street took 20 minutes. The precinct was a grey building that looked like despair had a physical form. She parked 2 blocks away, because even now, even after everything, the parking closest to police stations made her nervous. Walking toward authority made her nervous. At the desk, she gave her name. A woman in a uniform led her down a hallway that smelled like coffee and fluorescent lights and other people's troubles. They entered a small room with a table and 3 plastic chairs. Detective Chen was waiting for her. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with grey hair and the expression of someone who'd seen every variation of human suffering and was beyond being shocked by any of it. "Miss Bennett," he said, and gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." We recovered some items from a residence in the loop, and we found your name and address in documentation. We need to know if any of this belongs to you." He opened a box. Inside were things she recognized. Her college textbooks. Her mother's jewelry box. Letters addressed to her in handwriting she knew. A backpack she'd left behind 3 years ago when the eviction happened, when everything moved so fast she couldn't grab everything. "These are mine," she said, and her voice sounded very far away, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "Where did you find them?" "In a storage unit rented under Marcus Webb's name. We executed a search warrant this morning based on a complaint filed by his ex-wife. He'd stored items that didn't belong to him, along with some items we need to hold as evidence in a separate investigation." She looked at the detective, and something inside her chest began to crack, not in the way that breaks completely, but in the way that cracks suggest the thing might actually hold together if you don't touch it too hard. "Is he in prison?" she asked. "No," the detective said, and his expression softened in a way that told her he knew more than he was saying. "But we're looking for him. He skipped bail on an assault charge 3 days ago. We think he left the state. You can take these items, and we'll be in touch if we need anything else." She gathered the box. It was heavier than she expected. 3 years of her life compressed into one cardboard box that probably weighed less than 20 pounds. The detective walked her back to the lobby, and as she was turning to leave, he said something else. "Ms. Bennett. If he contacts you, you call us immediately. Understand?" She nodded, though she didn't understand anything anymore. She walked back to her Civic carrying the box, and she sat in the driver's seat and opened her mother's jewelry box, and she held her mother's rings in her palm, and she cried the kind of tears that only come when something you thought was lost forever turns out to have been waiting for you all along. At 6 p.m. on Wednesday, August 14th, Isabella Bennett still had $34 in her pocket, but now she also had her mother's rings, her college textbooks, and the knowledge that Marcus Webb was somewhere far away, running, gone, possibly forever. She didn't know yet that by 6:22 that evening, the entire trajectory of her life would change. She didn't know that the street vendor's son would be bleeding on a sidewalk, that she would stand between violence and innocence without calculating the cost first, that Dominic Corsetti would watch her do it, that the question he would ask her at dinner would be the question she'd been waiting her whole life to answer. For now, she drove to the park and pulled into an empty lot near the lake, and she watched the sun set over the water, and she held her mother's rings, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to believe that maybe, somehow, her life could change. The city lights were just beginning to flicker on as August surrendered to evening. The August heat pressed down on Chicago like the lid of a coffin. Isabella Bennett woke at 4:06 in the morning in the back seat of her 2004 Honda Civic, her neck twisted at an angle that made her shoulder blade scream. The parking lot behind the closed factory on East 47th Street was empty except for her, cracked asphalt stretching toward a loading dock where pigeons nested in broken windows. She had parked here legally, permission purchased with coins she'd scraped from the convenience store register, coins the manager didn't know she was collecting. $3.42 per shift, saved from returns. That's how you survive on nothing. She pushed herself upright, and her back seized. 8 years of welts carved into her skin didn't forgive anything, least of all sleeping in a car. The movement sent a ripple of fire down her spine, a reminder of Marcus Webb that lived in her body whether she wanted it to or not. She had been free of him for 3 years, ever since the night she'd walked out of their apartment with $400 she'd been hiding in a coffee can and nothing else. 3 years of washing other people's dishes, scrubbing other people's bathrooms, folding other people's laundry, and still the scars remembered. Isabella grabbed her backpack from the passenger seat and opened the car door. The morning air hit her face, not cool, already warm with the promise of another brutal day. She changed clothes using her side mirror as privacy, a ritual she'd perfected. The Civic's interior was organized with the precision of someone for whom disorder meant catastrophe. One clean shirt hung on the hook behind the driver's seat, one pair of jeans folded on the seat itself, a toiletry bag containing a toothbrush, one tube of toothpaste, and a bar of soap so worn it was nearly transparent. At the bottom of the backpack, underneath everything, was the photograph. She didn't look at it every day anymore. That was progress. The photo showed a hospital room and a newborn girl wrapped in a white blanket, her daughter, who had lived for 6 hours. Sophia. 9 years ago this November. Isabella had been 23 then, still married to Marcus Webb, still believing the promises he made when he was sober. The baby had been born without enough oxygen. The doctors said these things happen. The baby died at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday that Isabella could still describe in complete, crystalline detail. She had no idea that this photograph was the only thread connecting her to Dominic Corsetti. That a woman in a penthouse on the North Shore kept a nearly identical image, a stillborn daughter, a nursery with untouched furniture, a grief so heavy it had compressed itself into silence. But on this morning, as Isabella brushed her teeth with bottled water she'd bought at the corner store for a quarter, she knew nothing of the man who watched the city from 43 floors above, who hadn't slept properly in 7 years, whose code of honor was the only thing preventing him from burning the entire world down. She was alone, and that was all that mattered. The diner where she worked her first shift opened at 5:16 a.m. It was called Sal's, and it hadn't been painted since 1987. The owner was a man named Sal who paid her $8 an hour cash under the table, which was illegal and which they both understood absolutely. Isabella clocked in, though clocking in was a courtesy, no actual record existed, and tied an apron around her waist. The kitchen smelled like it always did, grease and burnt coffee and something underneath it that might have been sadness. The breakfast rush was 6 construction workers, 2 nurses finishing a night shift, and a woman Isabella had never seen before, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Isabella's rent. The woman ordered egg whites and coffee, and when Isabella brought the plate, the woman wrinkled her nose. "Could you ask them to be less greasy? They're practically dripping." "I'll let them know," Isabella said. She was very good at not letting resentment into her voice. By 10 a.m., Isabella had earned $4.50, including a $2 tip from one of the nurses, who saw her, really saw her, the way most people didn't. Isabella cleared the tables, wiped them down, and stacked the dirty dishes in the commercial washer. Her hands were already red and raw, the skin around her fingernails ragged. At this rate, in the next 2 hours, she'd earn enough to have $6.50. The parking permit required $40. She had $34 in her pocket from yesterday's shifts. The second job started at noon, an office cleaning company that sent her to downtown buildings after business hours. Today it was a law firm on the 40th floor of a glass building that cost more money to maintain than Isabella would earn in her entire lifetime. She cleaned bathrooms, vacuumed conference rooms, emptied trash bins. The pay was $9 an hour, and she worked exactly 4 hours, which meant $13. That brought her total to $19.50. At 4 p.m., Isabella had exactly $19.50. The parking permit cost $40. She needed the permit to sleep in the factory lot legally. Without it, she was trespassing, and trespassing meant fines, which meant jail, which meant the end of everything. She sat on a bench outside the office building and calculated. The evening shift at the convenience store paid $8.50 per hour. If she worked until midnight, that was $34 plus whatever tips or found coins she could collect. That would be enough. Barely. The shelter where she showered twice a week was called St. Catherine's House, and it was run by a woman named Evelyn Blackwell. Evelyn was 63 years old but looked like the kind of woman who'd never been young and never would be old. She existed in a permanent state of elegant, cruel middle age. Her hair was done professionally every 2 weeks. Her nails were always manicured. She smiled when speaking to the residents, but the smile was like a blade, and the kindness was like a performance someone was paying her to give. On Wednesday, Isabella showered at St. Catherine's at 5 p.m., which gave her an hour to dry her hair, change into her evening shift clothes, and make it to the convenience store by 6:15. The shelter had an industrial shower area in the basement, and the water was hot and strong, the kind of water that would have felt like luxury if she wasn't paying for it with her time and her presence and the small humiliation of being seen as a woman whose life had fallen apart so completely that she had nowhere else to go. She was drying her hair when Evelyn appeared in the doorway. "Isabella," Evelyn said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. You look exhausted, dear. I'm fine, Isabella said. She wasn't fine. Her entire body ached. She had eaten a single apple since yesterday morning. You know, I have connections. Very good connections. I could help you find more permanent accommodations. If you're willing to be flexible. Evelyn smiled, and something in Isabella's chest went cold. Flexible was a word that men used, and it always meant something that had nothing to do with actual help. I'm managing, Isabella said. She kept her voice quiet, even. Thank you, though. Of course. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. Isabella didn't change her mind. She finished drying her hair, changed into the navy vest and khaki pants that the convenience store required, and walked to the corner store where she worked her third shift. The sun was beginning its descent toward the lake, and the evening air smelled like hot asphalt and distant rain. The radio in her Civic, which she'd left parked 3 blocks away, to save on gas, played a song she didn't know, but she could hear it anyway, somehow, riding on the wind that swept down from Michigan. The convenience store owner was a man named Rahul who was kind to her in a way that made her want to cry. He didn't pay her more than $8.50 per hour, but he never questioned her when she asked to use the bathroom, never made her feel like she was stealing when she bought the cheapest items, never suggested that she was anything other than exactly what she was, a person doing her best with nothing. At 6:02 p.m. on Wednesday, August 14th, Isabella had been on her feet for over 12 hours. She had earned approximately $27.50 across 3 jobs. She had $34 in her pocket, which meant she would have enough for the parking permit, which meant she would have a legal place to sleep. Her back ached. Her feet screamed. Her hunger had moved beyond pain into a kind of white noise that she'd learned to work around. The store was quiet. One customer was buying cigarettes. Rahul was restocking the refrigerated section. Isabella was organizing the snack aisle when she heard it, a scream that cut through the evening like a blade through silk. It came from somewhere outside, maybe half a block away. A child's scream, not an adult voice, something young and terrified and filled with a specific kind of pain that Isabella recognized. Her hand stilled on a bag of potato chips. She could keep organizing. She could stay where it was safe, where nobody knew her name, where she was invisible. Another scream. I'm stepping out for a minute, Isabella said. Rahul didn't even look up. Sure. 2 minutes, okay? She walked out of the convenience store onto East 47th Street. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. 3 blocks down, near a small restaurant called Marcello's, there was a commotion. A cart had been overturned, a tamale cart, the kind operated by street vendors who couldn't afford permits. A man was screaming. A boy, maybe 6 years old, maybe 7, was on the ground, bleeding from his mouth. 2 men in suits were standing over him, and Isabella recognized them immediately, not by name but by type, the kind of men who took what wasn't theirs because they could. She started walking toward them. The first man saw her coming. His name was Rocco, though she didn't know that. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his suit cost more than 6 months of Isabella's rent. Keep walking, lady, he said. She didn't keep walking. The second man, Nino, stepped forward. He was younger than Rocco, maybe 30, with the kind of face that came from a childhood of getting everything he wanted. Did you not hear him? You are not invited to this conversation. Isabella looked at the boy. His eyes were locked on hers, and in those eyes was the kind of desperation that only comes from someone who has already decided that nobody is going to help him. She thought of Sophia. She thought of all the small voices that went unheard because nobody with power was listening. Step away from him, Isabella said. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, and she had no authority to speak at all. Rocco laughed. It was a sound like gravel in a blender. You want to know what happens to people who get in the way of Dominic Corsetti's business? I want to know what happens to men who put their hands on children, Isabella said. And then, though she didn't see him, though she had no idea the restaurant doorway behind her was occupied, someone was watching. A man with dark eyes and a scar that ran down his left cheek and hands that had signed orders for things that couldn't be undone. A man who'd lost a daughter 9 years ago on a Tuesday, the same Tuesday Isabella lost hers, and whose entire empire was built on the principle that violence against the innocent could not be tolerated. In that moment, Isabella Bennett, who was nobody, who had $34 in her pocket and a car she slept in and a job that didn't officially exist, stepped between two of the most dangerous men in Chicago and a terrified child, and she did it not because she calculated the cost, but because the cost of not doing it was unbearable. The night air went absolutely still. The candlelight caught the exhaustion in her face like a blade of gold cutting through something broken. Isabella sat across from Dominic Corsetti in his private booth at Marcello's, the humid August night pressing against the windows, thunder rumbling distant over Lake Michigan. The air conditioning barely cut through the heat. The restaurant had closed an hour ago. It was just them, the soft clink of ice in untouched glasses, and Rocco and Nino standing by the door like statues carved from marble and bad intentions. Dominic was 42 years old. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples, and a scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone like a map of violence he'd survived. He wore an open white shirt, cashmere draped over the back of his chair, a coat worth more than 2 years of her rent. His hands, when he moved them across the table, looked like they had signed orders for things that couldn't be undone. "My son Micah has a congenital heart defect," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "The valve between 2 chambers is malformed. Blood is not flowing where it needs to flow. He needs surgery in 5 days, Miss Bennett. 5 days, or he dies. Do you understand what I am saying? In 5 days, my son will be dead." Isabella's hands folded in her lap. She had not eaten since yesterday. She had not slept properly in 6 months. "The surgery costs $150,000, Dominic continued. $150,000. I can pay it. Money is not the obstacle." He slid a folder across the white tablecloth. Inside were medical documents, surgical schedules, and a photograph of a surgeon in his 50s with intelligent eyes and a wedding ring. Dr. Raymond Chen is the only surgeon in Chicago qualified to perform this procedure. He's the best. And he refuses to operate on my son. Why? Isabella whispered. Because I owe him a debt he believes I will not repay. Because he is afraid. Because his daughter is dying, and he wants leverage. Dominic leaned forward. The candlelight caught the hollowness in his own eyes. Maya Chen is 7 years old. She has a rare blood disorder. She needs a bone marrow transplant. 3 years ago, you donated bone marrow at Northwestern Medical Center. You're a universal match for her blood type. Extremely rare. Dr. Chen has been searching for a match for 2 years. The system found you in its database. The folder trembled in Isabella's hands. $34. That was all she had. $34 and a Civic with a check engine light that had been on for 8 months. He'll operate on Micah if you agree to donate to his daughter, Dominic said. The surgery cost, the $150,000, he'll waive it. All of it. Gone. In exchange for your bone marrow. Isabella looked down at the photograph of the little girl in the folder. Maya had her father's intelligent eyes. She was bald from chemotherapy. She was smiling anyway. Why would you need me? Isabella asked. You could force him. A man like you could force anyone to do anything. The silence that followed stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Rocco shifted his weight by the door. Nino's jaw clenched. I don't hurt children, Dominic said quietly. And I don't hurt people who save children. You stood up for that boy today. You stood up for my son when you didn't know who he was. You didn't calculate the cost. You just stepped in front of violence and said no. He paused. Thunder cracked across the sky outside, so loud the glasses rattled. I'm asking you, Miss Bennett. I am asking. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The next morning, Isabella sat in a clean white consultation room at Chicago Memorial Hospital. The walls were the color of surrender. Dr. Raymond Chen sat across from her with the posture of a man carrying something too heavy to ever put down. His hands shook slightly when he held them on the desk. "The bone marrow extraction is a surgical procedure," he explained. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had worn grooves into his speech. "We'll use a needle to extract from your hip bone. 2 procedures, one to harvest from you, one to transplant into Maya. You'll experience pain. There will be bruising. For 48 hours, you'll feel like you've been struck repeatedly with a hammer. But the procedure itself is routine. People recover." "When?" Isabella asked. "This week. Before Micah's surgery. The timeline is critical." He slid a consent form across the desk. "The surgery for Micah costs $150,000. I'm waiving the entire amount if you save my daughter. $150,000 you will never have to pay. $150,000. The number was so large it didn't feel real. It felt like a number from someone else's life, someone who mattered, someone the world had decided was worth saving. Isabella signed the consent form without reading it. When she shifted in the chair, her back made a small sound of protest. The scar's tissue underneath her shirt pulled tight, a map of 8 years written in welts and infections and nights when she thought the pain would split her open. "Are you injured?" Dr. Chen asked. He was looking at the way she'd shifted, the wince she'd tried to hide. "Old scars," Isabella said. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. And what she didn't know was that Dominic Corsetti had Chen's office bugged, had heard every word of this conversation, and was already making phone calls about a man named Marcus Webb who lived at 847 North Clark Street in a basement apartment with a history of domestic violence arrests that had been mysteriously dismissed. That afternoon, Dominic brought Isabella to his penthouse. The elevator rose 42 stories without stopping. The doors opened onto a hallway with marble floors and paintings that probably cost more than a house. Rocco and Nino followed behind, carrying grocery bags, fresh vegetables, herbs, things that didn't come from a can. They exchanged glances neither of them had exchanged in 15 years. In 15 years of working for Dominic Corsetti, they had never seen him bring a woman into his private space. Not once. The penthouse was obsessively clean. It smelled like lemon cleaner and expensive air. But there was one room that broke the pattern. One room that had been sealed off, untouched, a shrine to something that had broken him 9 years ago. The door was slightly ajar. Isabella saw the white crib inside, the pink blankets, the name spelled out in wooden letters, Sophia. Dominic did not explain. Isabella did not ask. Then Micah appeared from the kitchen, pale as moonlight, oxygen tubes in his nose, but his eyes bright. He saw Isabella and ran to her, his small feet pattering against the marble floor. "You're the lady. The one who stopped Uncle Rocco from being mean." Micah grabbed her hand with both of his. His skin was cool. His pulse was probably racing already. "Are you staying? Papa never brings anyone here. Are you staying forever?" Isabella knelt down so they were eye level. Micah was 5 years old. He smelled like baby shampoo and something medicinal. He reached up and touched her face with the kind of gentleness that only children have, the kind that comes from knowing fragility. "I'm going to help you get better, sweetheart," Isabella said. Micah hugged her. His arms were thin as branches. "I'm going to call you Mama," he whispered into her shoulder. "My real Mama is in heaven with Sophia. Papa cries sometimes but he doesn't know I hear. He cries in the dark." Something broke in Isabella's chest. An actual breaking, like a bone finally giving way under pressure it had carried too long. Dominic stood in the kitchen doorway, watching his son clutch this homeless woman like she was oxygen itself. His hands gripped the counter. His knuckles went white. Rocco muttered to Nino, "Boss looks like someone just shot him." That night, Isabella returned to St. Catherine's shelter for her twice-weekly shower. The water heater worked maybe half the time, and tonight was her lucky night. Hot water cascaded over her scarred back, washing away 3 days of dust and fear. She was toweling off when footsteps approached. Not the shuffling of other residents. Purposeful. Measured. Evelyn Blackwell waited in the office. 52 years old, tasteful pearls around her throat, the kind of smile that belonged to women who had never been told no. She owned the shelter. She also owned the parking lot where Isabella slept. "Isabella, dear," Evelyn said. Her voice was honey over broken glass. "I hear you've been seen with Dominic Corsetti. How fascinating. A homeless woman and the city's most dangerous man. I own this shelter, you know. And I own the lot where you park that little Civic of yours. $75 a week would secure your shower privileges and parking. Or..." She paused. The pause was worse than any threat. "Other arrangements could be made. I'm very flexible with women who understand how the world actually works." Isabella recognized predators. She'd lived with one for 8 years. She left without showering. Outside, the parking lot was dark. The humidity hung like something alive. She was walking toward her car when a hand grabbed her arm, not hard, but firm enough that escape required a decision. Marcus Webb stood in the shadow between streetlights. 40 years old. The same cruel smile that had carved her back with a belt buckle. The same eyes that had told her 1,000 times that she deserved everything that happened to her. "Found you, Bella," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered. "You think you can hide? You think sleeping in a car makes you free? I've been watching. So you with that Mafia man and his brat. Does he know what you are? Does he know what you let me do to you?" Isabella pulled away and ran. Her car was 20 feet away. 20 feet and a locked door and an engine that might actually start. "Evelyn Blackwell says hi," Marcus called after her, his voice cutting through the dark like a blade. "Yeah, we know each other. She told me exactly where you'd be. We have plans for you, Bella. Big plans." She made it to her Civic, locked the doors, and shook for an hour in the humid August darkness. The steering wheel was hot beneath her palms. The air inside felt like drowning. But what she didn't know was that Dominic had men following her for protection, watching from a black SUV parked 3 blocks away. Rocco had just photographed Marcus Webb's face and was running his criminal record through contacts in the Chicago Police Department. And in his penthouse, Dominic Corsetti stood at the window looking out over the city, his hands curled into fists, something cold and dangerous stirring in his chest like a blade being drawn from its sheath. The storm was coming. It was already here. The rain came at 2 in the morning, and Isabella Bennett sat in her Civic with the windows fogging, the humidity so thick it felt like drowning. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel. The bottle of sleeping pills sat in her lap, plastic orange, a pharmacy label with her name printed in black letters. $34. That was all the money left in the world, and she had spent it on this. Her phone lit up again. The 16th missed call from Marcus. She listened to the voicemail because some part of her still believed she deserved to hear it. His voice came through the speaker, cruel and certain. "I told Corsetti's people about your scars, Bella. About what you let me do. About how you liked it." A pause. The sound of him breathing, satisfied. "He won't want you near his son now. Nobody wants damaged goods. You think you're somebody because some Mafia man played hero? You're still mine. You'll always be mine. And when he finds out the truth, he'll throw you away like trash." The voicemail ended. Isabella sat in the darkness of her car, parked behind the abandoned warehouse on 40th Street where no one looked, where no one cared. She opened the pill bottle. One white tablet fell into her palm. Then another. The rain hammered the windshield like fists. This was mercy, she told herself. This was the only choice left. But through the rain-streaked glass, taped to her dashboard, she saw it, the drawing Micah had given her yesterday. crayon on white paper, held together with invisible tape that had yellowed from age. A tall stick figure labeled Papa in uneven letters. A small figure labeled Lemmy. And a woman with yellow crayon hair, stick arms raised like she was dancing or flying, labeled in careful letters, Mama. Isabella's hand stopped shaking. She looked at that drawing for a long moment. Micah's dark eyes, serious as a judge, handing it to her in Dominic's kitchen. This is our family now, the 5-year-old had said. Before it was broken. Now it's fixed. He had pressed it into her hands like it was something holy. She put the pills back in the bottle. Not today, Marcus, she whispered. Not ever again. Dawn broke grey over Chicago, and Dominic Corsetti did not sleep. He never slept on nights when the decision had been made. He stood at his office window on the 52nd floor, looking out over the city as it woke, the highways beginning to move, the early delivery trucks, the streetlights clicking off one by one. The folder sat on his desk. Rocco had placed it there at 4 a.m, photographs, addresses, phone records, criminal histories dating back 15 years. Marcus Webb. 40 years old. Wanted in Indiana and Missouri for aggravated assault, domestic violence, 3 restraining orders that he had systematically violated. Currently employed by Evelyn Blackwell as an enforcement consultant for her shelter properties, which meant he threatened tenants who couldn't pay, collected payments for evictions, made examples of people who asked for help. The conspiracy was intricate and methodical. Evelyn Blackwell had sheltered Isabella at her facility, had learned her name and her vulnerability. When Dominic's interest became apparent, Evelyn had made a phone call to an old associate. Marcus Webb had been released from a halfway house in Detroit specifically to find her? To break her? To poison the one thing that had pulled her back from the edge of a chemical sleep in a locked car? Dominic's hands were curled into fists. Rocco entered without knocking. In 15 years, this was their rhythm, no words necessary until words became essential. Everything is arranged, Rocco said. His voice was steady, professional, the voice of a man who had done this work many times. 12 men. Vans positioned. Nino is at the warehouse district. The Santoro family has been contacted. They're waiting. Dominic nodded once, still looking at the city. And the woman. Safe house on North Shore. 2 men posted outside. She doesn't know yet. She woke up an hour ago, drank coffee, was reading to Micah. A pause. Rocco shifted his weight. She's not broken, sir. Whatever that man said to her, whatever poison he put in her ear, she's still fighting. Something cold and dangerous stirred in Dominic's chest, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. He had spent 15 years building a reputation that made men tremble. He had ordered retribution that resulted in disappearances, in bodies found in the Chicago River weighed down with concrete, in families who stopped asking questions because asking meant dying. But he had never, not once in 15 years, felt the clarity that he felt now. The purity of it. This was not business. This was something else. Let's go, he said. Marcus Webb woke to the sound of his door being kicked in. The wood splintered like matchsticks. He scrambled backward across the mattress, his underwear soaked with sweat, his body moving on pure animal panic before his mind caught up. Rocco and Nino stood silhouetted in the doorway. Early morning light from the hallway turned them into shadows. They moved into the apartment with the ease of men who had done this many times. No, 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 Marcus said, his voice climbing toward a scream. I didn't touch her. I just talked to her. I just scared her like I was supposed to. Evelyn told me to scare her. Rocco's voice was dead calm, the voice of a judge reading a sentence. You carved your name into her skin. You carved it with a belt buckle for 8 years. You think talking is all you did? They grabbed him before he could move, his arms pinned, his body lifted like he weighed nothing. He screamed then, a raw, jagged sound that echoed down the apartment hallway. A neighbor's door cracked open. They looked out and immediately closed it again. This was Chicago. You did not interfere. Please, Marcus gasped as they dragged him toward the door. God, please. I'll disappear. I'll leave the state. I'll leave the country. Please, you don't understand. Evelyn made me do it. Evelyn. Evelyn made me. He screamed her name as they loaded him into the back of a black van parked in the street. The door slammed shut, muffling his final pleas. The engine started. The van pulled into traffic, moving east toward the industrial district, toward the docks where the water was deep and the shadows never quite lifted. What happened after the door closed is a detail that the historical record does not provide. What is known is this: Marcus Webb was never seen again. No body was recovered. No ransom demand ever came. He simply ceased to exist, as completely as if he had never been born at all. At 9 in the morning, Evelyn Blackwell stood in the main hall of St. Catherine's Shelter, welcoming Chicago's wealthiest women to her annual charity brunch. She was wearing white linen, a pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, her hair styled in the way that announced money and breeding. She smiled as the mayor's wife arrived, as a senator's daughter embraced her, as photographers snapped pictures for the society pages. The federal agents entered through the back door. There were 4 of them, and they moved with the specific gravity of people carrying arrest warrants. The room went absolutely silent. Champagne flutes paused midair. The string quartet continued for approximately 3 seconds before the violinist realized what was happening and lowered her bow. Evelyn Blackwell, the lead agent, said. His badge caught the morning light. You're under arrest for housing fraud, embezzlement of federal funds, conspiracy to commit extortion, and conspiracy to commit assault. Evelyn's face went white. This is absurd. I'm on the mayor's council. I have connections in this city. You cannot possibly. The agent cuffed her wrists. The metal snapped around them like a period at the end of a sentence. News cameras had already begun setting up outside. Dominic had made a single phone call to a federal prosecutor who owed him a favor, a man whose daughter had been kidnapped by a rival family 5 years ago, a man who had never forgotten who called in the Marcus to bring her home. That phone call had been enough. Every fraudulent deed was suddenly evidence. Every stolen grant. Every tenant threatened. Every protection payment disguised as administrative fees. The folder was already with the IRS, the FBI, the local police department. Photographs of falsified documents. Bank statements. Voice recordings of Evelyn threatening a 60-year-old woman who couldn't pay her processing fee. They led her toward the exit, and she was still denying, still claiming connections and influence, still certain that her place in Chicago's hierarchy would protect her. But the photographs flashing outside, the news anchor speaking her name with the particular venom reserved for the wealthy caught in corruption, the sight of her own charity board members turning away from her as she passed, these things told a different story. Federal charges carried a minimum 40-year sentence. Her assets were frozen. Her shelters seized by the city. Her reputation, built over 30 years, dissolved in the space of a single morning like sugar in rain. Both of them, then. Both of them destroyed. Not through the same darkness, but through different hells entirely. One vanished into violence and silence. The other exposed to light and judgment, her shame made public, her name dragged through every headline in Chicago. Justice, Dominic had always believed, was not mercy. Mercy was a luxury for people who could afford forgiveness. Isabella Bennett would never have to afford it. She would never have to be afraid again. When they told her, she was reading to Micah in the safe house, her voice gentle, the boy's head resting against her shoulder. The story was about a princess who was afraid of storms, and how she learned that the rain was just water, that thunder was just sound, that darkness always ended when the sun came back. Rocco appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, professional, the face of a man delivering information. But something in his eyes was different. "It's done," he said. "Both of them. It's finished." Isabella went absolutely still. The book remained open in her hands. "He can't hurt you anymore," Rocco said. "He can't hurt anybody anymore. And she's going away for a very long time. Isabella closed the book slowly. Micah looked up at her, confused because the story wasn't over, because the princess hadn't learned her lesson yet. But Isabella was looking at something beyond the walls of the safe house, beyond the rain that had finally stopped, beyond even the memory of 2 in the morning and a bottle of pills and a drawing taped to a dashboard. She was looking at something that felt like breathing. Like living. Like the possibility that the darkness, at last, was finally gone. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed against the silence like a broken prayer. Isabella Bennett sat in the recovery room, her arm bandaged from the bone marrow extraction, her body still floating in that strange space between anesthesia and waking. Her veins felt hollow. Empty in a way that matched the rest of her. Through the fog, a voice. Dr. Chen's voice, steady and controlled. "You saved my daughter," he said. Maya's transfusion had taken. The bone marrow that Isabella had given, harvested from her own body in a procedure that cost nothing because she had nothing to charge, had pulled a 5-year-old girl back from the edge. Maya's recovering. She's going to be fine. And now I'm going to save your friend's son. Isabella tried to focus on his face. The doctor was crying. Actually crying, his hand shaking as he held her chart. "That surgery," he continued, his voice breaking like ice under weight. $150,000. The cost you could never pay. The number that kept you awake at night. He set the chart down and squeezed her hand. "Consider it paid in full. Not by money. By something worth infinitely more." For hours passed in a blur of monitors and beeping machines. Nurses came and went. Someone brought her water. Someone else adjusted her for. Isabella floated through it all, suspended between terror and hope, waiting for news about a boy with dark eyes who had drawn a picture of a family he didn't have yet. When they brought word that Micah's surgery was successful, that his new bone marrow had taken, that he would live, Isabella's body convulsed with a sob so deep it felt like her ribs might crack. Her hands gripped the hospital sheets. She had no tears left to cry, but her body cried anyway, in gasps and shudders, in the kind of relief that only comes when you've held your breath for so long you forget how to breathe at all. She woke in a private room at Sunset, not the charity ward. Not the hallway outside the surgical theater where they usually put women like her, women with nothing, women who took up space that was needed elsewhere. Dominic Corsetti sat in the chair beside her bed. He was still wearing the suit from the morning, navy silk, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the weight of his empire visible in the way he carried himself even sitting down. His face was sharp with exhaustion. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes, storm grey and relentless, were fixed on her as if she might disappear if he looked away for even a moment. "Rocco said you slept in your car through a thunderstorm," he said. His voice came out rough, not the controlled tone she knew. Not the sound of a man used to controlling everything. This was something raw underneath. 2 nights ago. Before they admitted you. You drove through rain so heavy you couldn't see the windshield, and you slept there anyway. Isabella's throat was dry. Hospital dry. Medication dry. But she managed to speak. "I didn't have money for a hotel. You had $34. He leaned forward, and his hand found hers on the blanket. His skin was warm. His grip was gentle in a way that contradicted every story she'd ever heard about Dominic Corsetti. "I know because I had my people find every detail. Every dollar you've ever spent. Every place you've slept. Every time you went hungry so Micah would eat." He paused, and when he spoke again, the words came out like a confession. "You were going to save my son and go back to nothing." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Isabella whispered. Dominic reached into his jacket with his free hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving her time to see he was not reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a set of keys. They were heavy, silver, the kind of keys that opened doors to places people like her only saw in movies. He set them on her blanket, on top of the hospital sheets that smelled like bleach and industrial soap. "Penthouse upstairs," he said. 3 bedrooms. A view of the city. Everything you need. He paused. Everything Micah needs. He's been asking when Mama comes home. Isabella stared at the keys. Then at his face. Then back at the keys. I'm not his mother, she said, though the words felt like a lie even as they left her mouth. He chose you. Dominic's eyes didn't leave hers. I watched him choose you the day you agreed to donate. He looked at you like you were the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. And watching him choose you made me realize something I'd been running from. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. I'd already chosen you too. He reached into his jacket again. This time, he pulled out a framed child's drawing, the same drawing Micah had made weeks ago, the one Isabella had taped to her car dashboard. The family portrait. 3 stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. The woman labeled Mama. The man labeled Papa. The boy labeled Micah. He drew this the day you agreed to the surgery, Dominic said. He knew before I did. He knew what you were going to do. He knew you were the one. Isabella's vision blurred. The room tilted. She was crying without sound, her shoulders shaking, her free hand covering her mouth because she couldn't quite believe this was real, that she wasn't still in her car in the rain, dreaming of a life where people like her got to have a family. 1 week later, Isabella moved into the penthouse. The elevator opened directly into the main living space, and the view of Chicago spread below her like a promise. Downtown glittered in the afternoon light. The lake stretched to the horizon. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Her backpack, the same canvas backpack that had held everything she owned 6 months ago, the thing that had sat on the passenger seat next to Micah as they drove through the night from state to state, looked absurd against the marble floors. Pathetic, even. One small square of worn fabric in the middle of a space that could have fit 10 apartments like her old one. Micah found her standing there, frozen by the view. Papa said we can make the nursery yours, the boy said. He was still pale from the surgery, still moving slowly, but his eyes were bright. He was alive. He was healthy. He was holding her hand. Or we can make it an art room. Do you like art, Mama? I like art. I want to draw you again. I want to draw you the way you really are. How do I really look? Isabella asked, kneeling down so they were at eye level. Like someone who's not afraid anymore, Micah said simply. And somehow, a 5-year-old had named the thing she couldn't say out loud. That night, after Micah slept in his new room, a room with walls painted soft blue and a bed big enough for a child who had survived what shouldn't be survivable, Isabella and Dominic stood on the penthouse balcony. The August air had finally cooled. The humidity had broken. The city stretched below them, all lights and distance and the kind of beauty that belongs to people with money, people with power, people who never have to ask for permission to exist. Marcus won't hurt you again, Dominic said. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, the solid presence of his body between her and the world. I heard, Isabella said quietly. She didn't ask how. She would never ask how. Thank you. You saved my son. His voice was steady now, controlled again, but underneath it was something softer. Something that sounded like breaking. I would burn the city down for less. Isabella pulled her shirt over her head. The scars on her back were visible in the city light coming through the glass, welts and burns and marks that spelled out Marcus's name in different languages of pain. 8 years written across her skin. 8 years of learning how to be small, how to disappear, how to make herself less than human so that a human could feel bigger. Dominic traced each scar with his fingertips. Then he bent down and kissed them, one by one, his lips gentle against skin that had learned violence instead of touch. These don't define you, he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder blade. Not the ones on your back and not the ones in your heart. What you did with $34 and a backpack defines you. What you did for a child you didn't know defines you. The choice you made to stand between violence and a stranger defines you. She turned to face him, and he kissed her as thunder rumbled in the distance, as the storm that had followed her for so long finally began to pass. 6 months later, on Christmas morning, Micah ran through the penthouse in pajamas that matched both of theirs, dragging them toward the tree with the kind of enthusiasm only a child who had nearly died possessed. "Faster," he demanded, laughing. "You're too slow." The tree was enormous. 10 feet tall, covered in lights that made the whole room glow gold. Presents were stacked beneath it, so many presents that Isabella had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of it, by a life where people gave gifts just because it was a holiday, not because they had to choose between a gift and eating. Micah's drawing was presented with ceremony. He pressed it into their hands, his small face serious, his dark eyes exactly like his father's. "I drew what I want for Christmas," he announced. It was the family portrait again, but this time the woman labeled Mama had a ring on her finger. The line connecting all three of them was darker, heavier, permanent. Dominic pulled out a small velvet box. "Funny," he said. "I got the same idea." The ring was white gold, simple, elegant, the kind of ring women with money wore without thinking, the kind of ring Isabella had once seen on a woman's hand as she cleaned up spilled coffee at the diner, and she had stared at it like it was proof that God existed somewhere, that grace was possible, that not all beauty was meant only for other people. It slid onto her finger like it had been waiting there her whole life. Micah cheered so loudly that Rocco came running from the kitchen, hand instinctively going to his jacket before he understood it was joy he was hearing, not danger. "We're a real family now," Micah declared. "I told you it would work. I told you from the very first day." That afternoon, they visited Dr. Chen's house. Maya answered the door, healthy and glowing, her color returned, her energy restored. She and Micah ran off to play immediately, two children who had learned what it meant to survive, bonded in a way that other children couldn't understand. Dr. Chen pulled Isabella aside, away from the bright sounds of the children. "You paid for a surgery with a price that had nothing to do with money," he said. "You gave what money cannot buy. You taught me what value really means." He looked at the ring on her finger and smiled. "I'm glad. I'm so glad." As they drove home through Chicago in the early evening, Dominic's hand holding hers, Micah asleep in the back seat with his head against the window, Isabella thought about the woman she had been. Homeless. Terrified. Carrying 8 years of scars like a map of hell. Invisible to everyone except the people who wanted to hurt her. $34 in a bank account. A backpack holding everything. And the woman she had become, not because a rich man had saved her, but because she had saved a child first, and everything else had followed from that single decision to stand up, to say no, to decide that nobody puts their hands on a kid while she's breathing. The surgery cost $150,000. Isabella never paid it with money. She paid with bone marrow. With courage. With the decision to give what she had when she had nothing else to give. Marcus Webb disappeared into Chicago's August night, dragged away screaming, justice delivered not by law but by the code of men who protect the things they love. Evelyn Blackwell sits in federal prison now, 40 years stretching ahead of her like a sentence with no pardon, her empire of cruelty dismantled, her social standing erased, her name meaning only shame. But Isabella Bennett sits in a penthouse with a son who chose her, a man who loves her scars and all, and a life built not on money but on the moment she decided to be brave when staying down would have been easier. The real payment wasn't the surgery cost. It was everything she was, given freely, for someone who needed her more. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. This story teaches us that even in the darkest moments, love finds a way. If you believe that, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us how this story made you feel. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.